Now that we can show microposts, it's time to learn how to create them through a web interface by writing a web form for microposts, and we'll also give users the ability to destroy their own microposts. As you might guess from that last statement, we're going to implement a security model using the same before filter ideas we saw in the last lesson. And we'll also make a first attempt at a feed of followed users' microposts. In the next lesson, we'll introduce the notion of users following other users, and as part of that, you'll get a feed of the followed users' microposts, a la Twitter. Of course, we're not in a position to do that quite yet, but we will take a first step in that direction. Let's start our treatment of the micropost interface by taking a look at a mock-up. This is a mock-up of the home page. So this is just the root path / with the usual site elements in the layout. And then inside the main part of the body, we've got just a question, what's up? And then a box for submitting the micropost content. And then on the right-hand side, we've got some information about the signed-in user. Again, this parallels the kind of homepage you find at Twitter. Notice one thing about this is that since we're going to be submitting this through the home page, we don't actually have a new micropost page. And in fact, we're only going to need 2 actions, as I mentioned before. So let's take a look at what the routes will look like. So here are the routes. We're going to post to /micropost to create a micropost, and we'll issue a delete request to /micropost/1, where 1 is the ID, and that gets routed to destroy. So post /micropost gets routed to create, then this second one gets routed to destroy, and that will delete the micropost with ID 1. So because of the simple structure of these URLs, the routes only need to include actions for create and destroy. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at the routes file. And under resources, microposts, it's only going to be create and destroy. Let's line these up. We're going to get started with our microposts actions by writing some tests for access control. This is usually a good place to start once you know about before filters. Among other things, security is always a paramount concern, so it's nice to get the security model locked down. But one thing you might notice if you look at the directory structure here is that we don't have a micropost controller, and we don't have a micropost controller spec file either. That's because we didn't do Rails generate controller microposts. We could do that now, but it's easy enough to do it by hand, and I think it's a good exercise. So let's create a micropost controller. And they're just plain Ruby files. Let's take a look at our users controller to get our model, or not the actual model in MVC, but to get a model file. So the way it works is class users controller inherits from application controller, so let's do that. You can see that there's actually something here, create controller class, so class microposts. And it makes some guesses about what we want to do, but we actually don't want to do this. And now we can make our create and destroy actions. And these actions just go along with the routes that we just created. So let's look down at the spec controllers. Here's the users controller spec. And it requires spec helper. Let's just copy this. In fact, let's copy render views too. And make a new file here. So the micropost controller spec is a plain Ruby file. Let's paste it in and say micropost controller. And then we need to put end here. And we should have some sort of describe block inside here for access control. So let's do that. So let's do describe access control. And it should deny access to create. And we're just going to post to create. And the response should redirect to the sign-in path. And it should deny access to destroy. Of course, we'll have more rules about this, but certainly you should be you have to be signed in to get to these pages, or to these actions rather. And the destroy route actually requires an ID. So let's just give it the ID of 1. It doesn't matter, but in order to get routed to the right place, it has to have an ID. So let's take a look at our tests. Usually you'll have to do a Control-C if you've just added some new controllers, because Autotest doesn't know about them until you rerun this test suite. So we've got a couple of failing. So here, this is the thing I just said. We would have a route matching problem. So what happened here is we need to restart Spork when we change the routes file. So while Spork is restarting, let's see if we can think about how we're going to do the access control. Let's look at the user's controller. Remember, we have an authenticate before filter, and then we can give it the actions that we want to authenticate. So let's go to the MicroPost controller and start Autotest again here. Let's take a look at the MicroPost controller. We just want a before filter. It's the same one. Authenticate. And in this case, we actually are authenticating everything in this file. In other words, both the create and destroy actions are being authenticated. So there's no reason to pass it an options hash. By default, it just will run the before filter for everything. So let's save this and see if you can guess what will happen. So we're still red. Let's take a look at this. Undefined local variable or method authenticate. Right? And this is because that authenticate method, this one that we're using for the before filter, is currently defined only for the user's controller. But it's really quite generic, right? I mean, it just says deny access unless signed in, and the deny access method itself is in the sessions helper. Here it is, deny access. Do this. So let's just hoist the authenticate method up into the sessions helper as well. Just put it in here. And so now we should be green. Let's take a look at it. Good. Can rerun the whole test suite, and while we're doing that, let's clean this up a little bit. And now we're ready to start with the actual functionality by making an interface for creating microposts. Now, before making the actual view, let's get the action working. Let's get the create action working. And the first step is to fix this typo here, access control. And then we're going to say describe post create. And then we need to figure out what it's going to do. So let's get rid of this. Usually we'll need some sort of before each block. In this case, we want to be signed in. Certainly, users should be signed in. We've just tested what happens when they're not signed in. So now the rest of this is going to involve the actual sign in. So @user equals, we can do test sign in. And then give it a factory. So now we're signed in, and now we can start describing what the behavior of the create action should be. So let's say describe failure, and when it fails, it should not create a micropost. It's useful at this point just to go back to look at the post create. So just recall what we did here in the user's controller spec. This is usually a good way to proceed if you are a little stuck. You think, well, what do I do to test the micropost controller spec? Well, just take a look at what you did in some other situation. Let's take a look at this. Describe failure. It should not create a micropost. And what should it do if it fails? I'm going to leave this blank for now. Let's say it should just re-render the home page. So it should render or re-render the home page. So the reason we've got this test is because, remember, the actual form for making new microposts should be on the home page. So let's do this. It should not create a new micropost. Remember, to do this sort of thing, we're going to put this in a Lambda block. Lambda do, and inside here we're going to say post create. And now we need to give it a micropost hash. And so typically what we do in this case, as you can see from the user's controller spec, is we make an attributes hash and then we post it. So instead of user attribute, we're going to do the same thing with microposts. So before each. And what we need here for a failure is something invalid. So let's do content. Doesn't matter what we do. We've already tested all the failure modes in the model, but this is certainly invalid, an empty content. So let's do this. And this should not change the micropost count. So micropost count. And then under re-rendering the home page, we'll post create and then we want to say the response should render a template. Should render the template pages /home. Remember, that's what the home page is. So this will also fail. And let's go down to the micropost controller. Under create, let's see what we can do here. Now, to get the failure to pass, all we need to do is render the pages /home, because this certainly won't create a new micropost, and it renders the right page. Good. So we've gotten the minimal thing working to get our test to pass. Now we need to do the success mode. So describe success. And now we want a valid attribute hash. Let's take a look at this. For each, do and in this case, it should create a micropost. Should change micropost count by 1. Again, if you get lost here, just go back and see what we did in the case of successfully creating a user. It's the same syntax. So let's save this. We can get this to pass. What we can do here is, well, we want to make a micropost here in memory, and then we can say if at micropost.save, then do one thing, else do something else. This is just the same as in the user's controller. So we saw here, and create. So we saw here we have at user equals user.new of params user. So we're going to have something similar here. At micropost equals, now we can't do micropost.new though. Remember, we want to create the micropost through the association so that it has the right user ID. And if you think about it, who's creating this micropost? It's whichever user is currently logged in, namely current user. So we can use the association. Remember, current user.microposts has a build method that is equivalent to calling micropost.new, except giving it the right ID of the current user. So .build, and then params of micropost. Remember, here we're passing a parameter, we're passing a hash with the key micropost down here too. So this is a way to make a valid micropost object with the right user ID. And then we want to say, well, let's say if we do just out micropost.save, this will get this success. This will get this to pass right here. And it's still re-rendering the home page. So now everything is passing. And notice that what happens is in this, it should not create a micropost. When this is invalid, it just falls off the end, and it renders pages/home. So it's nice to be able to distinguish between these two cases somehow. And what we're going to do is, on a successful micropost creation, we're going to redirect back to the root path rather than just rendering it. So let's take a look at this. It should redirect to the root path. Response should redirect to the root path. Should be red. So now we want to do if at micropost.save redirect to root path, else render pages home. Save that. So now it's passing, and now let's put in a flash success. Have a flash success message. So let's save this to get to red, and then go to the MicroPost controller and put in the flash message. And save it, we should get to green. Excellent. Now at this point we have a working action, but of course we don't have a form yet to make a new MicroPost, so let's do that next. Let's close down these guys. We're going to start on the home page. Now what we need to do here is break it into two possibilities. Let's say that this is what happens when a user isn't signed in. So if they are signed in, let's do if signed in. Remember we have this nice Boolean that returns true if someone's signed in. Else, and then end. So this shouldn't change anything. Let's just take a look at our browser. So that's working still. So now let's we need to put something in for signed in users though. So now I'm going to put in a table. This is a little bit ugly, but gets the job done. Doing this with CSS and so on is left as an exercise. This is so much easier though. It's not even funny. So the summary of this is the for signed in users. Let's do a tr. So table row, and the td is the main part of the page. So class equals main. And let's this is where we're going to put in our h1 here. H1 with the question that we're answering. What's up? And let's give this a class. This is a MicroPost h1. You might want to make it a different size or something. And now I'm going to render the MicroPost form. So we'll see later on that we're going to have the MicroPost form available from the user profile page as well. So remember we have a place to put these views that are used on multiple controllers. There's a shared directory here. So we're going to say shared is going to be a MicroPost form, and it's going to be a partial. So let's take a look at this. So let's render shared slash MicroPost form. And then in here we need to make a MicroPost form partial underscore MicroPost .html.erb. Oh, sorry, MicroPost form. And what should this look like? Well, it should be a form for. Let's do that. Form for. Usually we do a form for and then the model. So form for at MicroPost. Of course, we're going to have to put an at MicroPost instance variable somewhere. We'll have to create it in the controller. Do f, and let's put in our end. And now let's just put in some divs. Remember, we do a div with class equals field. If you look at new user, for example, that's what we did before. Actually, it's in fields. The fields partial. So we're just doing the same thing, right? So div class equals field, and then a label and a text field. So, well, in this case, it will be a text area. So let's do this. f.text area. Usually you use text fields for strings, but it just feels a lot more natural to use a text area. We'll see what this looks like. So this is text area for the content, and then another div for the submit button. So take a look at this. Now we're rendering this. And we can actually just take a look at it. Let's look. Oh, no, we're not signed in. Let's sign in. and go to the home page. Okay, undefined method model name for nil class. So this isn't too surprising, given that we haven't made an at micropost variable. So let's do that in, at micropost, singular. This is in the pages controller. That's where our home action is. So we've got an at title here. Let's do at micropost is micropost.new. Now remember, we actually don't want this unless someone signed in. So let's say if signed in. Otherwise, we're just rendering that other page. There we go. So look at that. We've got a working form. If you click submit, it even goes back because our create action is working. So if you click submit, you can see that we've put in invalid content and just boots us back here. So one of the things we want to get working is some sort of error messages here. And you'll recall that we have a shared partial for that. So let's get that working. There's this shared partial, this error messages partial. So let's take a look at that. Right here, we've got render shared error messages. We can just copy this right in. It's going to be here. There's something fishy about this, though. I hope you can see. You'll see in a moment. Yeah, so here's the problem. There's no @user variable. We've hard-coded this, the name of the instance variable. And so there's a really slick way to get this, this error messages partial to work for any object. And that's what we're going to do right now. So let's take a look at the error messages partial. Instead of @user, what we want is just whatever object has the errors. Because remember, any active record object will have this errors method associated with it. And so everything here will work if this is just a generic active record object. So let's assume that we're going to be able to do that. And just say if object.errors.any, and then put object in here. And we still have one slight problem, which we'll fix in a moment, which is that it still says user right here. But let's just replace all the @users with objects, object.errors. And now the way this works is that, remember, there's a way to pass a variable in here. So in this guy here, this line, f is f, this symbol will give us the name of the local variable in the partial. So if we do object, and then the object, in this case it would be @user, but there's an even cooler way to do this in a way that's completely unified. The f, the form object itself, knows what kind of object it's being used to build a form for. So form for @user, if you do f.object, this will be @user. And so we can use this exact same code in here. Where is it? Do this. Oops. That's in the micropost form. Here it is. So we can do this. And this will be exactly the same thing. So let's take a look at this. See if this works. Reload it. Look at that. There were problems with the following fields. Content can't be blank. The only problem is it says one error prohibited this user from being saved. And what's really going on here is we're trying to save a micropost. So let's change this. This is pretty slick. There's some pretty heavy Rails string manipulation going on here. And you can, if you look in the API, you might eventually figure out that this is how to do it. But this is really slick. So the way to do this is to put in some embedded Ruby, and it's going to be the object class to s, so to string. So if you think of this as being user, this is user to s, so this is the string user. Then we're going to call underscore on it. This is actually unnecessary in the present case, but this is needed to make it more general. And then we're going to do humanize dot downcase. So let's just verify that this works, and then we'll open up the console. There we go. So I just submitted it. It says one error prohibited this micropost from being saved. So let's take a look at the console. To get this to work, we actually need to include a module called Active Support Inflector. And even with this, it doesn't quite work the way we want it to. Let's take a look at how this works. We can say object equals user.new, and then object, let's take a look at this here. What do we have here? It was object.class.toS is user, is a string, and then we can call underscore on it. And I'm not oh, it did work. Look at that. I thought it wasn't going to work. So you can see what happened here. It just it downcased it. We humanize it, it upcases it, and then we downcase it. You may wonder, like, why do we do that? And the answer is because conventionally class names in Ruby are camel case, like this. And so if you do dot underscore, actually maybe this won't work. Maybe it's because it's a string. Let's take a look at this. Now there we go. So the way this works is that if you do underscore on a camel case word, it puts it like this. It makes camel underscore case, and then humanize does makes it nice and readable. And then if you downcase it, you get the lowercase version of it. So this little snippet will actually work for models that have this camel case convention. In our case, we have user and micropost, so it doesn't really matter, but it's nice to have the general case covered. Okay, so now that we've got that going, let's rerun our test suite. See what we've got here. Oh, look at that, we're red. So what's going on there? Let's take a look at this. Undefined local variable or method object. Okay, so in our error messages partial, there must be a place where we're not giving it an object. And actually, I think that makes sense, because what do? We've got new, and we have the microposts. Where is it? The micropost form. But there's also an edit page. Remember that we're actually showing users on the edit page. So edit. Yeah, look at that. So now we need to pass the object, and let's see if this works. No. Let's close this up while we're doing that. All right, so now we're green. So that's a really nice error messages partial that really works with any model. And now we're ready to move on to the second thing we saw in the mockup, which is a sidebar. Let's take a look at the mockup again. So we've got a box here, and then we also have this sidebar. So let's get that working. Let's go to the home page, and let's make it a TD. Class equals sidebar round. Let's just render a shared sidebar. We'll use this elsewhere, so let's call it user info, and now we need to make that. So let's go to shared. And I'm going to make a div. Let's say div class equals user info. And let's put the whole sidebar information set. That's the gravatar, the username, and the micropost count in an anchor tag. So it'll all be just one big link to the user. So let's do this. Let's do href. It turns out it's easier to use an anchor tag here rather than a link to, because there's so much stuff inside it. So let's take a look at href equals, and now we can do some embedded Ruby. User path to the current user. So this is just going to be the current user's information. Let's put in the ending tag there. And now let's make a gravatar for the current user, but make it really small. So it's going to be 30 by 30 instead of 50 by 50. And let's make a span. These are just using some of the classes that we put in the CSS file before. Current user name, and then let's make another span. And now we want to pluralize the micropost. Now before we had a label. Let's go over here and look at the profile. And we see here microposts 50. So here microposts is a label. And if this were the number 1, it would make sense to say micropost 1. But in this case, it doesn't make any sense to say 1 micropost. So we're going to pluralize the microposts using the pluralize method. We saw this before in the error messages. So pluralize, and then how many it is, how many microposts in this case, and then the word we want to pluralize. So here we've got pluralize object.arrays.count. So the way pluralize works is it's the number of objects there are, and then the word we want to pluralize. So let's take a look at this. This is going to be pluralize current user.microposts.count, and then the word micropost. So this will be one micropost if this thing is one, and otherwise it'll be, say, 2 microposts or 17 microposts. In this case, it'll be 50 microposts. Let's go back here. There we go. So you can see how it worked, that we put an anchor tag around the whole thing, so that means no matter where you click here, it takes us to the profile. So at this point, the form should be working, the errors are working, everything's working. So let's put in a micropost. Let's say, hello world. Micropost created. Now, we're not currently listing microposts on this page. Of course, we will be doing that eventually. This will be where the feed exists. But if you click over here, you can see that hello world is in fact the micropost that's most recently made. So what do we want this homepage to look like? Let's look at a mock-up. This is a basic idea of what we want the homepage to look like with a feed. Now, in this case, we're not actually going to do the feed. We're just going to put the user's microposts on this page. In the next lesson, we'll see how to make it a real feed. So let's go to the user model. Actually, this might be a good time to make a commit. Let's add everything and see what the status is. Yeah, definitely a good time. This is all of the interface that we made. This is the micropost interface. Great. And so now let's go over to the user model. And in the user model, we want to have a feed method that will eventually be the actual feed of all of the followed users' microposts. But in this case, it's just going to be the users' microposts themselves. So let's open up the user spec and go down to the micropost associations. And let's see, what do we got here? We've got 2 microposts. And inside of here, let's describe the feed. Describe status feed. And let's start off with just saying that it should have a feed. So a user should have a feed. @user.should respond to feed. Let's go down here and put in a method. Let's see if we can put it, let's put it here. It's called the feed, and at this point, let's just have, well, let's just save it. This should be red, or should be green, rather. Let's go back here, good. So what else should this feed do? Well, certainly we want the feed to include the user's own microposts. So it's going to be the feed of the microposts of the followed users and the user's own micropost. So it should include the user's microposts. So @user.feed. Let's see, it's actually, I'm going to do this, .include question mark, and we're going to go up to this micropost @mp1. The user feed should include @mp1. So @user.feed.include question mark @mp1 should be true. Of course, we're red as desired. So let's take a look at what this include question mark method does. Let's go to a console, and so include question mark is a method on an array. So let's look at 1, 3, foo. Let's just say a is equal to that, and a.include question mark foo is true, and a.include bar is false, and so on. So in our spec here, when we do @user.feed.include question mark @mp1 should be true, this will be true when the user feed includes the micropost. But it turns out that we can use the Boolean convention in our spec to say this in a much more natural way. @user.feed.should include at MP1 without the question mark. Now this is kind of amazing, actually. I'm not sure how RSpec does this, because include is actually a Ruby method already. If we look at our if we look at our auto test here, it actually is doing nil.include question mark. So this is doing the right thing. Remember that at user.feed right now is just this, and an empty method definition just returns nil. So what's happening here is RSpec is trying to call the include question mark method on the on a nil object. But so we want the feed to include MP1 and MP2. So we can save this and we'll still be read. And now let's take a look at the user model. One of the principles of testing is to do the very least you can do to get this thing to pass. So we could have the feed be the user's micropost, but we can actually get this to pass right now by returning all the microposts. And part of the reason we did that is because that way this next test will fail. We're going to say that not only should the feed include the user's microposts, it should not include a different user's microposts. Unless, of course, the user is following that user, but we don't have that idea yet, at least not in code. It should not include a different user's microposts. So let's make a new micropost. Let's call it MP3, which is a factory micropost. And let's have the user be just some new user. So let's do a factory user. And email. Remember, we have this idea of a factory dot next of email. So this is the next email in the sequence. And let's format this a little more nicely. And now we can say at user.feed.should not include MP3. Now let's take a look at the feed. And instead of doing micropost.all, well, so first of all, we could, in fact, return all of the user's microposts. And that's what we're going to do right here in a roundabout way. So let's get this to green and show that if you just say self.microposts, that this passes. Remember, we have user.micropost, but inside the object, it's the user is just self. And we can also leave off the self. Unless we're assigning to it, we can just say micropost. So this is nice and pithy, but this will not generalize at all. So what we want to do is make a micropost find. We're going to find all the microposts where. So this is a new syntax in Rails 3. Micropost.where user underscore ID equals question mark, and then the user's ID. So this is just actually self.id, but we can leave off the self dot. So let's save this, and we'll see that we're still green. There we go. So this dot where does a conditional find. It actually finds the microposts where the user ID is equal to, in this case, probably just the number 1. We can look in our test log. Let's take a look at this. And let's run that one test. It's user spec should not include a different user's micropost. Let's just run this one. And if you tail the log, actually, let's take a look at this. There we go. So this bottom line is the select. It selects microposts dot star from microposts where user ID equals 1. So that's what that where clause did for us. And this question mark notation, it ensures that whatever comes after this string is automatically escaped. The reason that's important is because SQL is susceptible to an attack called SQL injection, where you put code in that causes the SQL database to execute possibly very dangerous queries. And so by always using question marks as placeholders for variables, we ensure that that never happens. In this case, nothing really can go wrong because this ID is just an integer, and it's just an auto increment key. But it's a really good habit, always, always, always to escape your SQL. So the reason we use this more general notation is that in the next lesson we'll be able to build on this idea to make a real feed. And now we're ready to put a feed on our home page. So let's go to the Pages controller. And in here, let's say if signed in, let's make a micro post. And let's also make a feed items instance variable. This will be the current user dot feed. Remember, we just added a feed method to users, and let's paginate it. And then on the home page, let's just render a feed after the micropost form. So let's do this. It's going to be a shared feed, and of course we need to make that. So let's go to shared, make a feed. So underscore feed.html.erb, and the feed itself will only render if there are some feed items. So if at feed underscore items dot any, and let's put in a table of microposts, is similar to what we've done before. So let's say table class equals microposts, summary, and now we're just going to render a partial. I'm going to use an explicit partial key, and then the value is the name of the partial, shared / in this case I'm going to have a single feed item. And the reason for that is because that's the notation you need for rendering a collection. So I'm going to render a collection of at feed items. Before, we've seen how you can render, say, all of the users on the user index page. If you just do render at users, this renders the collection of users, the users array. But in this case, because we're not using an object that has a controller, it doesn't have a views subdirectory, we need to do a little bit more work, but it's still pretty easy. You just give it a partial and then give it the collection, and now we need to make a feed item partial. Underscore feed underscore item. And the feed item is just a table row. Let's do tr. And let's make a td, which is class gravatar. And let's link to the gravatar. We're going to link to the gravatar for this particular user, but remember what we have in this partial, because of the way we've called this, we've called it with a collection of at feed items, and the partial is named feed item. So what we have in here is a local variable called feed item, which is a micropost. So what we want is the gravatar for the feed item dot user. We want the user associated with this feed item, and we want to link it to that same user. Let's make another TD here. Let's make a span for a user. There's a lot of HTML here. You can just copy this from the book if you want. Span class equals user. And now let's link to the user again. Let's make a span for the content. Another one for the timestamp. Now, you may have noticed that there's quite a lot of overlap between this and the micropost partial, and eliminating that duplication is left as an exercise in the book. So if, after all that, our home page actually works, it'll be a miracle. Let's take a look. Wow, look at that. That looks like it pretty much worked. So what's up? Is it paginated? Oh, I guess we don't have enough to invoke pagination. So this looks pretty good. This is a link to the profile. This is also a link to the profile. So that looks pretty much like what we were hoping it would be. So there is one problem left, which is that if we submit this thing, we get an error. And the reason for that is because when we submit, we're submitting to, where are we submitting to? We're submitting to the micropost controller. And what happens here is it tries to render pages/home, but you can see that we just created a feed items array right here. It's actually a will paginate collection object, but you get the idea. And yet in this micropost controller, we don't have such an array. So let's add in a feed items array, or really it's a will paginate collection. And let's just refresh this page. So this should work. Okay, and actually before, when I said that we didn't have enough micropost to invoke pagination, that was wrong. I just forgot to put in the pagination. We actually have 51 microposts here. So let's take a look at the feed partial. So I actually want a pagination link right here. Let's, under here, let's do will paginate. Remember, will paginate can take an optional argument, which is the collection. So this is feed items. Let's take a look at this. We resend this, and now it looks like it's working. But if you look at the pagination links, the URL here is /micropost ? Page equals 2. So if you click on that, it doesn't work because the micropost action here doesn't know anything about. There's nothing at /micropost. This would be the micropost index. So I'm sure that we could work around this problem somehow, some way. But by far the simplest solution in this case is just to make an empty array here. So instead of putting the feed items here with the pagination and trying to get everything to work, let's just put an empty feed items array. And so you can see what will happen here if you submit something. Now it's just blank, and that's fine. When you're submitting an invalid post, it's okay if there aren't microposts being listed. So let's go back to the home page and just make one more micropost. Goodbye, moon. And micropost created, and you can see now it shows up right here in the feed. To complete our micropost interface, let's make a working delete link for each of these microposts together with a destroy action. Here's a mock-up of what we're looking for. We've got the box that we have already implemented with the micropost, and we just want some delete links here on the right side. So let's get that working. So let's add delete links to the feed item partial and to the micropost partial. So here's the feed item partial. Let's make it a TD, and let's link to delete feed item. So remember, we're linking to a micropost, so this is going to actually just be a link to /micropost/ whatever the ID is, which is the required route for deleting things, as long as we do a method delete. And then let's put a confirmation in. And we need a title to make it valid HTML. Oh, and I promised to show you what the title did before. Let's take a look at this. It's in /users. If you mouse over this, that's the title. Delete Joel, delete Mrs. Kylie Nolan. So we're going to have the same thing on this page. In fact, we have it. Look at that. Now, of course, we don't want to show these links to everybody, so we should have a test that says if, remember we have this current user helper, current underscore user question mark. If the feed item user is the current user, then we should show this link, otherwise we shouldn't. And we want to do the same basic thing on the micropost partial. In fact, let's just copy it. It'll be pretty much the same. You can see why there's some refactoring here. That's a good idea to eliminate this duplication. So instead of feed item here, we need micropost. And the same thing, micropost. Oh, it should be micropost.user. Did I get that wrong here? Yeah. If current user feed item.user. Yeah, so if you were confused there, now you know why, because I screwed up. Now, of course, this will arrange to show the links only for the authorized users, but that's a terrible, terrible thing to rely on for security. We actually need to secure it at the controller layer, and we're going to write tests for that shortly. So let's take a look at this. Got this, and if we go to the profile, we should have delete links here too. So there's something broken. There's a syntax error. Let's take a look at it. I see, we're missing a comma here. In fact, that these guys don't line up right here. These guys don't line up. That's a hint that there's something missing. So there we go. And I'm curious to see if our test would catch that. Let's see if I bet our test will catch that. So we hope that we're red here. Good. Let's just rerun them. And while we're doing that, let's take a look at what the next step is, which is to secure this destroy action in the micropost controller. Yeah, we're green. Good. Now we want the micropost controller. And we want to work on this destroy action. So let's close down. We've got a lot of stuff here, a lot of tabs. Let's focus on this micropost controller and the micropost controller spec. So we have describe post create. Now we're going to have describe delete destroy. Let's break it into two cases, one for an unauthorized user and one for an authorized user. So let's say we wanted to describe blocks for an unauthorized user. So let's make a before each block. So what should an unauthorized user look like? Well, let's make an @user, which is factory user, and let's make a wrong user. Let's make a micropost that belongs to @user. So factory micropost user is @user, and then let's sign in as the wrong user. So if we do that, then what should happen? Well, it should deny access, right? It should deny access. So if we delete destroy, so issue a delete request to the destroy method, and the ID is @micropost. This should deny access. So it failed because it's currently allowing access. Let's go over here. And so let's add a before filter. Let's say before filter authorized user. And we only need to do this on destroy. The notion of an authorized user is ill-posed for create, as I mentioned before, because you can only create a user through the current user. But in destroy, now it's protected, so let's save it. Oh, actually, no, we actually need to define this. Authorized user. And so let's find the micropost. What will this be? What we want to do is make sure that the current user, that is, say, the logged in user, is the same as the micropost user. So let's say @micropost equals micropost. Let's find it, params of ID, and then we want to redirect Typically, we've been redirecting to the root path for unauthorized access. Redirect to root path unless current user question mark at micropost.user. So this should work. In fact, were we read? We weren't read because we're not actually testing anything here. We need to say response dot should redirect to root path. I'll talk about redirecting to the root path. So let's get rid of this before filter and make sure that we're actually read. Good, and now we should be green once we do this. Oops, except we need to uncomment this. There we go. Good, now we're green. Red, green. The red part is important. Now let's describe for an authorized user. Even if there's only one example, I like to use a before each block, because oftentimes you'll want to add another example. It's just so much easier to put it in a before each block. It's the same thing here. I'm going to say user equals test sign in factory of user, and let's make a micropost. Same thing actually that we had before. In fact, there's a little refactoring here. Let's worry about that in a moment. And I want to say that it should destroy the micropost. If you delete destroy as an authorized user, it should delete the micropost. And remember, the way to do this is to wrap this up in a Lambda block. And then say this should change, in this case, micropost.count, or micropost, and then you have to give it a symbol, micropost count by -1. This is the same thing we did with user destroy. So this is going to be red. Good. Because we're not actually doing anything in destroy right now. So let's destroy it. So this might actually be red still, right? Because it's trying to render a destroy template, and there is no such thing. So let's put a test in for that. Let's say lambda do delete destroy, response should redirect to the root path. Some people are a little bit careful about only putting one test per example, but I think sometimes it's okay just to stack them up like this, to have two things. So now we're going to redirect to root path. And now we should be green. Excellent. So let's just go check to make sure these links actually do what we think they do. Let's delete this one. Good, so it actually did delete it. In fact, if we want, we can even put in a flash. Yeah, that's nice. At this point, there's one really weird thing I want to mention, which is a problem I've run into in the micropost partial. So let's open that. I've had this strange problem where sometimes the micropost.user association doesn't work. It raises an exception even. And I thought maybe it was just me, but I've had some readers report the same problem. So just in case you run into it, I want to mention it. And this is a good example of how sometimes you just have to work around a problem. So what happens is micropost.user raises an exception. So I'm going to say user equals micropost.user, which should always work, but it sometimes doesn't. At least it didn't until recently. And I'm going to replace this with just user. Now, this is exactly the same code, but if it raises an exception, we can do what's called a rescue. So if you do rescue, and then, well, what is this? This is user dot find, we can find the user based on the micropost's user ID. Now, of course, it's really weird that user ID would work okay, but micropost.user itself wouldn't. But in my experience, sometimes this is what's necessary to work around it. So this is just an aside. I hope that whatever problem caused this has been fixed by now. But if you run into that problem, it's so strange that it's worth knowing about this workaround. Now, as in previous cases, we haven't actually tested the HTML for any of the forms. So it's a nice idea to write an integration test just to make sure that if we go to the home page and we click on the button with invalid or valid micropost content, that it does the right thing. So let's write an integration test, and then we'll be done with the microposts. So let's open up the micropost spec. Get rid of this. So what do we want this to do? Well, let's put it before each block that involves signing somebody in. So user equals factory. User. So that signs the user in. And now let's describe micropost creation. So describe creation. And let's go into failure and success modes. Describe failure. It should not make a new micropost. Lambda do visit root path. We're going to fill in the box, fill in. So this is one of those cases where it's nice that you don't have to use a label, because we don't have a label for microposts. Let's take a look at this. If you look at the source for this form, the text area here is micropost content. So it's really nice that you can use the CSS ID. This is the ID of this element in the integration test. And if this is invalid micropost content, we should fill it in with something blank. Let's click the button, and the response should render the page's home template. And it should have an error explanation div. We don't really care about the content here. We just want to make sure there's a div. And it should not change the micropost content or micropost count. So let's get this running. Usually you have to do a Control-C if you've added a new test or a new test file. Describe success. Good. We're still green. Remember, integration test should be green by construction. So it should make a new micropost. Lambda do. And actually, let's put the content here. Visit root path as before. Fill in the micropost content with the content, and then click the button. Response should have selector, and now we want it to be span.content. We've tested for this elsewhere, but it's easy enough to test here. And then should change the micropost count by 1. So these are really testing everything. They're going to the page, they're clicking the button, so that means that all the HTML is working, everything is tied together just the way we want it. So let's Control-C one more time, and then we'll be ready to make a final commit.